Let me tell you something fundamental, something that might not be easy to hear, but must be heard. India was never just a piece of land. It was, and still is, a civilization, a living, breathing, moral and philosophical tradition, older than almost any other. And for centuries, foreign powers tried to fracture that tradition, not just with weapons or laws, but with ideas, with narratives, with shame. They didn't just colonize the land, they colonized the Indian mind. They told us our language was inferior, that our philosophies were backward, that our spirituality was irrational, that our systems of thought, ethics, and science were crude and laughable. And we, many of us, believed it. That's the real tragedy. The conquest wasn't just political, it was psychological. But something is happening now. India's story did not begin in 1947. And to think of it only in terms of its modern political independence is to make a grave mistake. A mistake that obscures centuries of profound suffering, endurance, and above all, survival. Because India's history is not just a tale of kings and borders. It is the narrative of a civilization that was wounded, silenced, and subjugated, not only through physical chains, but through something far more devastating, the erosion of dignity and the theft of meaning. The colonization of India was not just the occupation of land, it was the occupation of identity. It was not simply that foreign powers extracted wealth and resources, though they did, mercilessly, systematically, and with staggering cruelty. It was that they rewrote the Indian mind. They imposed a narrative wherein Indians were conditioned to doubt the worth of their own heritage. They were taught to mock their own customs, to see their languages as primitive, their sciences as outdated, their spirituality as superstition. This was the deeper conquest, not of the soil, but of the soul. Imagine what it does to a people when generation after generation is told that their ancestors contributed nothing, that their ways of life are irrational, that their culture is inferior. It is a kind of slow violence, one that does not bleed the body, but hollows out the confidence. It leaves behind a haunted emptiness, a space where self-respect used to live. Young Indians went to schools where their own epics, their own sciences, their own philosophies were omitted or ridiculed. They were handed foreign books, foreign ideals, foreign heroes, and told this is progress. And so many believed it. They had to. Because when you are colonized, you are not just ruled, you are reshaped. You become a stranger to yourself. And this reshaping was not accidental. It was strategic. Because a people who are disconnected from their own roots are easier to govern, easier to manipulate. They have no compass to resist. They are told what to value, what to believe, what to aspire to. And because they have forgotten the rhythm of their own civilization, they listen, they submit. The British did not build India. They built railways to take resources out. They built institutions to create a class of administrators who would think more like them than like their own ancestors. They trained generations to speak the conqueror's language, not merely as a tool of communication, but as a tool of thought. They replaced respect for local knowledge with blind reverence for European standards. They told a story in which India was always broken, always backward, always waiting to be saved. And that lie stuck. But here's what's astonishing. Despite all that, the Indian civilization did not vanish. It bent, but it did not break. It waited, quietly, through oppression, through famine, through unspeakable indignities. It held on. That's what people don't understand about India. It is not a country that was discovered in the modern era. It is a civilization that has endured, layered, intricate, profound, through every storm history could hurl at it. And yet, for so long, Indians were asked to believe that they had no right to be proud of this, that pride was dangerous, that it was regressive, that looking back meant stepping back. But how can a tree grow if it is ashamed of its roots? Colonialism did not just take from India, it forced India to feel ashamed of what it already had. That's the insidious part. It didn't just install foreign rule, it installed internalized inferiority. And that doesn't end with the raising of a flag or the singing of a national anthem. That doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers in education systems, in media narratives, in cultural insecurities. It seeps into the subconscious of a people until they no longer need to be ruled externally because they've learned to diminish themselves. And this is the real battle, not the one fought with guns, but the one fought within. The war for dignity, the war for self-respect, the war for truth. Because when a people remember who they are, not in arrogance, but in clarity, they become ungovernable by lies. They stop looking outward for validation. They stop apologizing for their existence, and they start to walk differently, think differently, speak with strength, not volume, with confidence, not noise. India's story is not just a story of what was done to it. It is also a story of how it survived being made to forget itself. And now, as the world shifts, as the balance of power realigns, as India rises once again, not just in economy, but in voice, there is something more important than ever: to remember. To remember not for nostalgia, but for necessity. Because you cannot build a future if you are ashamed of your past. You cannot be free until you know what was taken from you. And once you truly know that, no one can ever control you again. Not ever. There comes a moment in the life of every civilization when it must choose between decay and renewal, between forgetting and remembering, between silence and speech. And right now, India is standing at that threshold. Something is stirring, something old and forgotten, but not dead. It's subtle. It doesn't make headlines the way GDP figures do. It doesn't trend on social media the way political drama does, but it's there, in the quiet choices, in the recovering voice, in the eyes of a generation that no longer bows its head instinctively. This is not a renaissance of bricks and mortar. It's a renaissance of meaning. For centuries, India was made to feel like a fossil, a relic to be studied, not a consciousness to be lived. Its traditions were framed as outdated, its philosophies dismissed as metaphysical indulgence, its languages devalued, its symbols stripped of context and mocked. And worse, many Indians began to accept that view. They were taught to distance themselves from their own civilization, to be taken seriously on the world stage. But now something has changed. Slowly, organically, and powerfully, Indians are beginning to remember not just the facts of their history, but the value of it. They're beginning to sense that what they inherited is not a burden, but a gift. A vast intellectual ecosystem stretching across millennia, grounded in rigorous thought, ethical frameworks, sophisticated psychology, artistic refinement, and scientific inquiry. These were never secondary traits, they were central, and they are being reclaimed, not with prideful nationalism, but with clarity and confidence. You see it in the classrooms where young people are asking, why weren't we taught this before? You see it in the scholars who are going back to ancient texts, not as tourists, but as practitioners of thought. You see it in the arts, in cinema, in music, in architecture, where the impulse to imitate is giving way to the courage to originate. This isn't about nostalgia. It's not about glorifying the past as a refuge from the present. It's about understanding the past as a foundation for the future. The world is saturated with noise, with ideologies collapsing under their own contradictions. In that chaos, a civilization that remembers who it is becomes a lighthouse. India isn't reclaiming its cultural narrative to dominate. That's a crucial distinction. It's no longer content to be the exotic backdrop in someone else's story. It is writing its own script, in its own words, on its own terms. And that's terrifying to those who have long benefited from India's confusion. Because when a culture starts thinking again, truly thinking, not mimicking, but wrestling with ideas at a fundamental level, it becomes unpredictable. It can no longer be reduced to markets and stereotypes. It begins to shape discourse rather than just respond to it. It begins to export not just goods, but wisdom. And wisdom is more dangerous than power because it can't be bought, it can't be sanctioned, and once it's spoken, it can't be unheard. This is not theoretical. It is happening in the universities where ancient sciences and systems of knowledge are being studied with fresh eyes, in the debates about ethics, identity, consciousness, and truth that are being rooted once again in Indian frameworks rather than imported ideologies. In the tech hubs and startups where young innovators no longer feel the need to apologize for their names, their backgrounds, or their accents. In the global forums where Indian thinkers are no longer parroting the West, they're challenging it, correcting it, enriching it. That's what a renaissance looks like. It's not loud, it's not even always visible, but it's deep, and it doesn't stop once it begins. Because once people taste the dignity of remembering who they are, they can't go back to pretending they're someone else. But this comes with responsibility, because it's easy to get swept away by emotion, by reaction, by the desire to assert for the sake of That's not what this is about. This is not a revenge story. It is a restoration story. And that distinction matters more than we can possibly know. Because real cultural confidence is not loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It speaks with the quiet force of someone who knows where they come from. And when a nation reclaims its intellectual roots, when it begins to draw not just strength, but wisdom from its own soil, it becomes something profoundly difficult to control. That's why this renaissance matters. It's not about the past, it's about the future. A future where India is not defined by what others did to it, but by what it is now willing to become. And that future doesn't depend on governments or institutions alone. It depends on individuals, on whether you, yes, you, are willing to ask the harder questions, to confront the ignorance you were fed, to read deeper, to listen harder, to think, really think for yourself. That's where freedom begins. And that's where this renaissance leads. For a long time, the world was told a very specific story. It was a story with one center and many margins. The center was always the West, its ideas, its philosophies, its systems, its science, its morality. The margins were everywhere else. And India, no matter how ancient, no matter how rich in culture or complex in history, was made to believe that it belonged to that periphery, that its purpose was not to lead, but to catch up, that it existed somehow in a waiting room of progress, always behind, always reaching for approval, always one step away from being civilized enough. That story is breaking, not with violence, but with quiet, irreversible shifts. The world is no longer spinning around one axis. The monopoly over truth, meaning, and legitimacy that the West once held is crumbling, not because it was violently overthrown, but because it has exhausted itself. The certainty that once defined Western discourse has turned in on itself. The institutions that once claimed to be neutral and objective have revealed their biases. The intellectual dominance that once flowed in one direction from west to east has begun to reverse. And this moment is not just political or economic. It is existential. It is the rebalancing of how the world sees itself and how it allows itself to be seen. For decades, Indian voices were only permitted to speak if they echoed Western frameworks. If they wanted to be heard, they had to speak in borrowed terms. They had to frame their stories in ways that made sense to others, even if it meant misrepresenting themselves. The cost of being accepted was to be misunderstood. The cost of legitimacy was silence about one's own authenticity. But that cost is no longer acceptable. The world is now being forced to listen, not because India is screaming louder, but because it is standing straighter. When you reclaim your own voice, you don't need to shout to be heard. You only need to speak with truth. And India is no longer simply responding to narratives, it is producing them. It is no longer merely adapting technologies, it is creating them. It is no longer reacting to global trends, it is defining them. And that shift is not going unnoticed. For centuries, the West held the tools of influence, the publishing houses, the universities, the think tanks, the global media. They were the gatekeepers of what counted as rational, modern, or scientific, but the gate is rusting, and people are walking through it anyway. What's more frightening to those in power is that this new India is not trying to become a copy of the West, it is trying to become more fully itself. That's the real revolution. Because for so long, dominance was maintained not just through coercion, but through imitation. As long as others were trying to look and sound like the West, control was easy. But when a people begin to value their own thought systems, their own heritage, their own languages, their own definitions of truth and success, something powerful happens. They stop being manageable. They stop being predictable. They stop being dependent. And that's the world we're moving into now. A world where there is no single cultural compass, no one-size-fits-all model for progress, no final arbiter of what civilization ought to look like. This is a multipolar world. And more importantly, it is a multi-conscious world. A world where different ways of thinking, different sources of wisdom, and different rhythms of development are allowed to coexist without being ranked. But with this freedom comes a test. Because when the external domination fades, the temptation is to become reactive, to define yourself against the other rather than for yourself. That would be a mistake. India's role in this world is not to replicate Western empires in brown skin. It is not to dominate in the same way it was once dominated. Its strength lies in offering a different model, one rooted in thoughtfulness, complexity, and depth. A model that values not just efficiency, but meaning, not just competition, but harmony, not just material advancement, but inner development. This is India's burden and its opportunity. It must rise without becoming what it once opposed. It must lead without erasing others. And that is not easy, because power, when newly acquired, is intoxicating. It can make you forget what it felt like to be voiceless. It can tempt you to silence others. But real power does not speak to dominate. It speaks to elevate. It seeks truth, not victory. And if India can hold that line, if it can rise not just economically, but ethically, not just politically, but philosophically, then it will not just be another powerful nation. It will be something much rarer. A civilization that found its way back to itself and offered the world a new path forward. The West is not falling in flames. It is fading in confusion. And into that vacuum steps a nation that remembers, that thinks, that reflects, and now that dares to speak. What comes next depends on what that voice chooses to say. There's a moment in history when something irreversible happens, not with fireworks, not always with dramatic revolutions, but something shifts quietly, deeply, permanently. And when it does, you can feel it, not just in the headlines or in political speeches, but in the air, in the posture of people, in the confidence with which they walk, speak, think. India has reached that moment. For generations, India's spirit had been buried under layers of conquest, colonization, confusion. It was told to be grateful for freedom, even while still wearing invisible chains. It was told to modernize, but not to question whose version of modernity it was subscribing to. And so, for decades after independence, the machinery of governance changed, but the architecture of thought remained colonized. The script was still written elsewhere. Indians were still cast in roles not of their own choosing. But now, something else is happening. Something no foreign power, no global institution, no narrative manager can control. India is remembering, not in fragments, not in whispers, but as a whole. The fog is lifting, the confusion is fading, and in its place there is clarity. There is steadiness. There is fire. It's the fire of a people who've stopped asking for permission, a people who no longer feel the need to constantly prove themselves, a people who are no longer confused about where they come from or where they're going. It's in the voices of students who are no longer satisfied with the shallow explanations they were given about their heritage. It's in the rise of platforms where Indian thinkers, creators, and innovators are speaking in their own languages, their own philosophies, unapologetically. It's in the scientists who are not just replicating Western models, but drawing on ancient Indian insights and merging them with modern frameworks. It's in the artists, the filmmakers, the musicians who are returning to their roots not as a retreat, but as a foundation for something new. This reawakening isn't about going back in time. It's about retrieving what was buried, stolen, dismissed, and placing it where it always belonged, at the center. This is not nostalgia. It is not fantasy. It is not an escape from modernity. It is an act of spiritual and intellectual justice, a civilizational recalibration. And no one can stop it, not because it is aggressive, but because it is true. Truth has a momentum of its own. You can delay it, you can distract from it, you can suppress it for a time, but you cannot erase it. And the truth is that India was never a broken civilization waiting to be rescued. It was a sleeping one, recovering from centuries of wounds. And now it is awake. You can see it in how the world responds, some with awe, others with unease. Because an India that remembers who it is cannot be controlled. It will not play the assigned role of a consumer market, a geopolitical pawn, a culture to be mined for entertainment but never respected for wisdom. It will not apologize for its voice, its history, or its complexity. It will not bow because it no longer feels inferior. That's the power of self-knowledge. It doesn't need to conquer. It doesn't need to impress. It just is solid, immovable, rooted. And that kind of power spreads, not through conquest, but through presence, a presence that changes the conversation in any room it enters. India's reawakening is not a reaction. It's not driven by bitterness or revenge. It's not about proving something to the West or to anyone else. It's about fulfilling something long overdue within itself. A sense that this civilization, with all its layers, contradictions, and depth, still has something to offer the world, not in the form of domination, but in the form of dharma, not as a power-hungry state, but as a conscious civilization. And that is what makes it unstoppable. Because what you are seeing now is not the rise of a superpower in the traditional sense. You are seeing the reemergence of a civilization state one that carries with it thousands of years of knowledge, scars, silence, and wisdom. One that can no longer be shamed into silence. One that no longer looks to others for validation. One that finally understands its own weight, its own rhythm, its own light. This awakening is not just national, it is personal. It is the mother raising her children to be proud of their heritage. It is the teacher who decides to include ancient Indian knowledge in a curriculum long dominated by foreign thought. It is the young entrepreneur who speaks English fluently, yes, but dreams and innovates in their own mother tongue. It is the scientist who knows that Vedic knowledge and quantum physics aren't enemies, they're long-lost cousins. It is in the millions who are no longer afraid to say, we have nothing to be ashamed of. We never did. And once a people believe that, not because they were told, but because they discovered it themselves, there is no going back. No force can suppress a nation that has learned to respect itself again. No strategy can contain a culture that is no longer confused about its purpose. No system can subdue a civilization that has awakened not in rage, but in wisdom. When they say India is rising, they miss the point. India isn't just rising, India is remembering. And what follows that cannot be stopped. This reawakening is not just for scholars or leaders. It belongs to every one of us. Because a civilization is not some distant abstraction. It lives in the choices we make, the stories we tell, the courage we show to think clearly, speak truthfully, and act with integrity. Learn your history, not just the parts that were approved, but the parts that were hidden. Think with depth, question what you were taught. Take pride without arrogance, lead without fear, create without imitation, and above all, remember who you are and where you come from, because this is not a moment to observe, it is a moment to step forward. And the world is watching, not to see if India can become like them, but to see if India dares to be fully itself. So speak, stand, build, and carry this light forward, not as a reaction, but as a responsibility. The time of waiting is over. The time of remembering is now.